Well, I hope this will work tonight. Shame is a topic that I started speaking on, writing on over the last, I guess, 5, going on 6 years maybe. And I've had a lot of response when I have written about it, enough to say that it is a topic that could be written on a lot more. I got interested in it through some personal experience of coming to grips with some shame issues in my life, which I kind of knew a little bit about it, but I didn't realize how big an issue it was in my own life. And so it was very helpful and really was a catalyst in a healing over from a panic anxiety disorder that I'd had for 40 years or more. And so, that's to say this is powerful stuff. It's pretty universal, so I know to a degree I'll be preaching to the choir tonight because this stuff is simply part of humanity. So we'll see how this goes. I was standing in line at my local Target store, quietly minding my own business. Of course, I was wearing my cassock, so I suppose my presence was a little less than unassuming. And the woman behind me sneezed. To which, being the Southern gentleman that I am, I politely turned and said, "God bless you." She became visibly angry and growled, "Don't put any of your religion on me." I think, golly gee. Yes. It's like voodoo or something, I don't know. It was a Target store, but it could have been Facebook. There's just in terms of how the reaction was. By now, anybody attempting to communicate in America, even in polite, innocuous tones, should be aware that we're in an angry culture with a hair trigger. A monk pumping gas in Seattle is sucker punched in broad daylight back in April, laid out Abbot Tryphon. And that was just for looking like a Christian. I was accosted on the streets of London a few years ago and flipped off by a cabbie for apparently looking like, maybe a Catholic priest. I'm just going to blame it on them, because he couldn't have known I was Orthodox. He looked Irish. But, and I thought, well, they probably had it coming to them. So anyway, but my email inbox and the comments moderation on my blog are daily visited, not always a lot, but daily visited with at least one angry invective. A stranger from Romania who stalks me, he has his own special folder in my email thing. He doesn't know that, and mostly I don't ever see his stuff, but a stranger from Romania recently wrote me and put a curse on me. And I'm blaming that curse for why my shoes fell apart in the Atlanta airport. But there is a general observation that everybody makes that public civility is breaking down. And you can't blame it on one president or one candidate or things like that. It was broken. It was broken before that. But why? Why is civility breaking down? And the simple answer is the dynamic that surrounds the emotion of shame. That's the simple answer to the question about public civility. It is the dynamic that surrounds the emotion of shame. It's been said that America is a shame-based culture in which the topic of shame is taboo. So we're going to go into some taboo territory tonight. Civility is a word that refers to a set of social rules that serve to prevent undue shaming and thereby keep the peace. Having grown up in the South and been raised to be a gentleman of sorts, that basically meant keeping these polite rules that keep you from shaming people. I was in Florida a few years back with a priest buddy of mine who was from New Jersey. And I don't mean to slam his state, but he wasn't raised the way I was. And so they don't do that in New Jersey, but we're in this store in New Jersey it was in one of my first years as an Orthodox priest, and he was doing some training with him. We're in this store, not in New Jersey, but in Florida, and it's like an office supply store, and he was picking up something, and I don't remember what it was that the girl at the checkout counter did, but it upset him, and he kind of let her know. It said a few things. And anyway, later in the day, he was very perceptive. He said, "You looked like you were kind of upset with me in the store this morning. What's happened? What did I do wrong?" And I said, "A gentleman would never call out a cashier like that." And I said, "And you don't know when she's visiting your church." So, it's like, but it was, Father Barnabas understands these things. You just don't do that to people. It's like you don't do shame that way. Of course, these days, everything is there because the social rules in our culture have suffered greatly through various revolutions of the past 70 years ago. You wonder, am I supposed to hold the door open or not? All kinds of things that way. We're left as sort of a bit of the Wild West, as in we live in Deadwood and there is no sheriff in town. Okay? That's how life is for us. Well, over the past several years, I've begun to write and speak on the topic of shame and its place in the Orthodox tradition. Much of what I say and write about it could be found in almost any of the popular books on the topic. There's stuff like John Bradshaw's Healing the Shame That Binds Us, the things that Brené Brown has done, a number of other things. When I got interested in it, I started reading the heavy clinical material simply because I really want to understand what the mechanism in all of this is. But much of what I've found is you could find in those books, but how it fits in the tradition is not so clear, at least at first. And it's been a topic, as I say, that resonates with people when I speak or write about it. And so it makes sense for us to try to make our way through a culture that's riddled with shame and shaming. I'll say something in a little bit about what I call the shame of converts, the shame of conversion. You get the very easy version of this is someone who says they haven't crossed themselves because they're afraid they'll do it wrong and they feel that everybody's looking at them. And so generally I include the congregation ahead of time, and that first time they cross themselves, we all stop and applaud. No, they only feel like that. But there's that. There is that. You don't want to stick out. What's the number one question you get for priests sort of coming up like that? Is people want to know how to behave. Maybe that's doing evangelism in the South. What do people wear? And that's getting to be a very hard question to answer. If you tell them just to dress decently, they don't know what that means. So anyway, we lit through it. But it's important for us to know where we live, the setting that we're in, and the nature of the struggle that it puts before us, because this dogs our steps. You cannot be involved in public media, which is all social media, and ignore the reality of shame. It's just there, and it helps to understand it and perhaps to think some about how to deal with it. Shame is a lot more than just an emotional, psychological category. It seems to run deeper than that, and it colors a lot of our life and existence. A short psychological definition, and I'm sure you were waiting for this, a short psychological definition for shame that's often used by writers is how we feel about who we are. Okay? Guilt is about how I feel about what I did. Now, it may very well be that what you did makes you feel bad about who you are. And then they get sort of complicated and there. It's deeply involved in our relationship with God. who am I? I mean, we get a lot of inquirers in the South who've come from one version or other of cultural Calvinism. And they've got a God who shames them. I mean, if you're totally depraved, it's not really easy to feel good about who you are. And, it's difficult. Many people have grown up in churches, including in Orthodox churches, in which shame has been used as a pastoral tool. Now, I would say shame as a pastoral tool is a tool of spiritual abuse. It is not to be used. It's just not how you do things. We'll get more to that. But it's interesting, a lot of the clinical material describes shame as the master emotion, meaning it's not just about itself, but it seems to be keyed in and connected to other emotions as well. And so it has a very devastating aspect. It's described, I was taken aback the first time I ran into this. It was in a clinical book written by a Jewish shame researcher and clinician. He described shame as the loss of communion, which suddenly got my attention. Got a little underlining there and thinking, okay, I know about the loss of communion. The experience of shame, particularly in its stronger forms, cuts us off from others. It's how we feel. It isolates us, and it also cuts us off from ourselves. You just get you completely, you can be in these social situations, and we'll talk about some specific ones in a minute, in which something has shamed you, and you can almost lose the ability to see. You don't know who you are. You're kind of not certain where you're standing. You're stammering. You don't know the next thing to say. The first reaction to shame normally is your face flushes, your eyes look down. It's a very uncomfortable thing. I've learned, I'm just throwing this in for free, shame it's even present in infancy. I mean, we're hardwired with it. It's one of the emotions and affects that we're hardwired for. And I've noticed, like, mothers bringing up a child, toddler in the arms for communion, and they get close, and you're heading at them with the spoon, and suddenly they go and turn back. And mom's embarrassed, and, and the priest is being polite, and the guy's holding the cloth or trying to work with this baby, and as often as not, it's going to wind up in crying. The reason is the child feels vulnerable, which is one of the feelings of shame. And I've actually been experimenting, I hate to say that about in communion, but of when they're of a certain age, not making eye contact with them. Direct eye contact induces vulnerability. And so I kind of give them communion out of my peripheral vision, sort of, if at least, or don't look until it's right at the mouth, and it has been more successful than not. So for you priests, you just file that away as things I've learned in my shame research. But it's also, it cuts us off from ourselves, and so it's very much one of the deepest forms of loneliness. We feel isolated in it. An interesting thing about shame, in those who look at it in, like, how does the neurobiology work, just how your body's doing with it, is that it essentially is the interruption of certain positive things, like enjoyment or joy, an expected good experience, and it just gets interrupted. Something happens, you come into the room and you expect to be decently greeted, and it doesn't happen, and you don't. Then you suddenly are awkward and not feeling quite right. You walk up to someone that you haven't seen in a few years, and they don't remember you, and so there's that feeling of maybe there's something wrong with me. Who I am is not worth remembering. You had this expectation, and it was disappointed. Was disappointed. In its roots, that experience, oddly, has to do with how we experience boundaries. Boundaries are about no. You can't go there. No, you're not me. No, you can't have your way. This is my, it's no. I mean, if you're a child, they don't like it. What does a child do when you tell them no? Well, you know, they don't go, whoa, yay! You know, they may complain, they may cry, they may get angry and yell at you. This is all just sort of versions of what shame does in us. But it's always interested me that and we're going to come to the Garden of Eden, which is the great shame story in Scripture, but that God put a no in the Garden of Eden. All the trees are yes, eat them, but not that one. And the more I've thought about it, the more convinced I am, if you will, it was the only boundary in the garden. The only boundary. And without a boundary, you cannot know God. You cannot know God. I mean, one of the great German writer, Rudolf Otto, described what he called the idea of the holy. And one of the things he described it as the ganz anders, that is the utterly, totally different. And so there's this boundary. You stand before God, and as one old AA buddy of mine once said, the only thing you need to know about God is you're not Him. Yeah? And that's a place to start. You're not Him. And so that experience of no, because without a boundary, you'll never know Him. Any of you who've ever been in a relationship with a narcissist, it's not, and you're not happy about it. If you have, what you know is they don't have any boundaries. You belong to me. Like, every step you take, I'll be watching you, and you don't know how that affects me, etc., and on it goes. It's awful. It's awful. And clinically, they say that in narcissism, you have such a deep pool of shame that they can't go there. So it's very difficult to be healed. But it's not that they have no shame, it's they have way too much. And it would be overwhelming and devastating to go there. So if you've ever been in a relationship with one, I say that so that perhaps you at least can pray for them compassionately, even if you've created a boundary and left him. Okay? And that's oftentimes about the only thing that can be done. But, so there's that dynamic about it. And I'll draw this on I give another illustration. This deep experience, positively, the experience of communion described in clinical studies, they always go to the image of a nursing child. A nursing child and the relationship with the mother. There's a bond, there's a commonality of being and action, a unity, a union, love, warmth, belonging. It's primal. And it's given to us by God. It's just primal. And it's utterly necessary to the healthy development of a child. If you don't do it like breastfeeding, then you got to do some other kind of feeding. But that nursing and bonding experience is utterly essential. I told someone recently, and you women, your mamas know what I'm talking about, but I was telling someone, trying to explain Mary to him, I said, you got to understand, I don't know how many times a day Jesus was on demand nursing. I'm sure he was. I mean, it's the will of God, feed me. But anyway, but I mean, Mary is experiencing communion with God face to face, eye to eye, how many times a day for what? 3 years? 2.5, 3 years anyway? I mean, do you think about that? The union there, unbroken union that she knew. We were all created for that, and experiencing that as a child helps strengthen the sense of who I am. Even though I'm not asking that question, I feel comfortable in it enough that once I'm weaned and move away from that, I can begin to feel brave enough to risk going out into the world of boundaries. But there's always a coming back, which we'll see that in a few minutes too. But when we have an experience of shame, all sense of communion, both with others and ourselves, gets interrupted. Our face flushes, we drop our eyes, we don't know where to look, we become flustered. The instinct is to hide. I could have dropped through the floor, they say, you know. The instinct is to hide. Oh my goodness, I'll get to it, maybe we'll see. Shame is described as painful. Indeed, it's often experienced as so painful that rather than enduring it, it morphs. Okay, sorry. He's from the Greek. But rather than enduring it, we change it. And in changing it, most often shame changes to either anger or sadness. You say, you made me angry. What you mean is, you shamed me, and I changed my shame into anger. You know, if you're really, and I'd say this especially if, because anger is a gift from God too, and anger is a very short emotion. It gives a burst of energy. Anger can help you lift a car off your uncle, you know, that kind of thing, you know, toss the piano, whatever you've got to do. That's what anger is supposed to be for. If you've been angry for more than a few minutes, it's not normal anger. Something else is energizing it. And usually what's energizing it is shame. I mean, and we'll see how this works out there too. And if it's not anger, then it's oftentimes depression. Anxiety and depression play a very large part in the spiritual condition we call akathia, the noonday devil, listlessness. Think about time and despondency. It's just very much there. This experience of it. Shame is a vital and essential element, therefore, in the spiritual life, understanding it so I can deal with akathia. When we ignore it, it causes enormous damage that can easily be undiagnosed and unhealed. So, borrowing a little bit from some of the clinical stuff I've read, and I'm using a book that just I thought was very helpful. It just came out in November. The writer was Joseph Burgo, and it's just called Shame. It's got a subtitle. It's awful, these books that seem like self-help. They got terrible titles. Shame, free yourself, find joy, and build true self-esteem. And I just think, you know, cuckoo, cuckoo, I'm the walrus. But, I mean, it's like, do they just write these titles in California or what, you know? So, anyway, I think, write them down in Georgia and it'd be, and you too can be Orthodox. But anyway, I want to describe sort of 4 groups of shame that Burgo describes, and I found it just a handy list to work through this, and I hope it's not too painful. The first group are experiences of what he calls unrequited love. I feel let down. I feel sad. I feel disappointed. I defeated. Defeated or discouraged. I read this stuff and I can barely, you know, it's all I can do to get through it. It just touches all those words in me. I feel frustrated with myself. Oh, that's so much harder than being frustrated with you. I feel like I can't make the grade. You know, those of you who've come who haven't, say, published yet, but you're working and things like that, it's so risky. I mean, to write something and hand it to somebody and say, read this, oh man, that's vulnerability. You know, if you've put yourself out there, you poured yourself into a poem, you know, this bit of creativity, much less if the creativity is about the inner you. You know, you're revealing. Oh, that's so hard. It's hard to do. The preaching itself, if you use stories and things that way, it's Brene Brown talks about having a shame storm, which is you've gone, you've spoken, you were vulnerable, you go back to your hotel room and you're going, you know, just, and if you're like me and you have ADD, which means you have a tendency to just keep on talking anyway, much less rabbit trails and stuff. And you think I've got it, you should have seen my mama. But I mean, I'll get back to a hotel room after being somewhere and just thinking, I can't believe I said that. Oh, God. You know, and did you tape that? Oh, please don't put it out there on the internet. And then I look at it later and think, oh, it's not so bad. But it just felt that way, because the truth is I was just vulnerable. And, you know, Frederica talked about that. Are you ready yet to talk about this stuff? You know, part of me in dealing with shame was, I'm sort of ready to talk about it, because if I didn't talk about it, it was killing me. Yeah. And so sometimes vulnerability is the only way you can live, because the other stuff will eat you up. It'll eat you up. So you begin to have to find safe places. Feeling like a wimp or a dud. Male culture in America is almost nothing but shame. We play games with each other. We poke at each other. A man will say to the other guy, "You looks like you picked up a few pounds this Christmas." A woman never says that to a woman. You know? You know, a man will say to another man, "Did you know those pants make your butt look big?" Right? You never say that to a woman and live. And, you know, and so, but we do that. We poke fun. I mean, your sports teams, your team lost. Yay, yay. I mean, Father Ted Pisarcik down in Florida and I had a betting pool every year on Tennessee, Florida, till I quit. Because I got tired of losing, and that's just as simple as it was. But, I mean, my little brother only calls me up once every 4 years. He works on the Mississippi. He calls me up once every 4 years before the national election just to taunt me. He called me up before the last one, and he's talking about that guy. I said, "I'm not voting for him." He still taunted me. You know, it's just because that's what guys do. And it's just very difficult. You can feel inept, feeble, ineffective, inadequate, incompetent, feeling like a loser, weak, undisciplined. Oh, listen to people talking about their prayer rule. This is good for you. I pray like Robin Williams. But, so we desired something or someone, and we were rebuffed in one way or another. And it would be possible, you know, just to let it go or to assume that the problem was on their end, but chances are the experience will provoke some kind of shame. Now, the thing about shame is it's all kind of connected. There is a form of shame, an extreme form called toxic shame, that usually happens as a result of abuse. And that can be abuse as a child or any other time in life. And it's very, very difficult. And when toxic shame, frankly, toxic shame is absolutely worth picking up a phone and going to a therapist. It's absolutely worth however long it takes, because it's crippling. And, you know, so that's, and all kinds of things can happen with that. It's a function of PTSD as well, coming home from wars. I mean, and all kinds of things. A soldier saying, you know, to his priest, or especially if you're like in the military, chaplains, oftentimes the soldier's feeling bad about having killed someone, and the pastor gives them just war theory. Like, if you hadn't shot him, he would have shot you. Not a iota of which touches the shame, you know, because he knows in his soul that he has taken a human life and he needs to be healed. And that's the canons of the Orthodox Church. We'll go to that and diagnose it and heal it, and the medicine of communion and the medicine of fasting and of repentance. It doesn't matter who was right or wrong, you know. Legally, you should be able to sleep at night, but it doesn't let you go that way. So these experiences. Another second category, unwanted exposure. Feeling self-conscious, embarrassed, shy. My wife was, free me, Beth. Anyway, the other morning she was kind of late coming in. I make breakfast every morning. She was late getting there and kind of in a hurry, got to get out to work. And I said, well, what took so long today? And he says, well, I started getting dressed. And then I thought, no. So I tried something else on. And I thought, no. I mean, any of y'all had that? She's works in an office and you're trying to go through that. What is going on? Me, I just go to the closet and think, cassock. No. Do I want to wear black or black? But it's a difficult thing. And then there's the whole thing about shoes. But, we have that at my house as I'll come home and there's been a visitor at church, a lady, and she'll say something about them, and I'll say, which one was that? And she'll describe her shoes. And I think, I didn't know that's how you tell people apart. But apparently the ladies in my house do. So, but we can feel embarrassed, shy, or bashful, simply vulnerable or exposed, foolish or ridiculous, like an idiot. Oh, I hate that word. A dope, a jerk, mortified, or feeling like I'm a laughingstock. I was short as a kid, and I was a second son, and my older brother was big and athletic, and so I always felt like a runt and things like that. And so, like a lot of people that way, I became a class clown. I still am. And, it was survival. It's a technique for, protecting yourself. You may, in fact, lead with your vulnerability, but lead it with humor. And in fact, there's clinical studies that says the ability to laugh at yourself is actually a tool for healing certain kinds of shame. So it's not all wrong. And as I say, children can have a real instinct. So there's a lot of scenes that involve that kind of shame. Every speaker, including those who preach or teach, has the risk of this kind of shame, feeling exposed. It's said that public speaking is ranked as the number one fear in our culture. People would rather take a bullet than to stand up and talk in front of people. God, I'm so courageous. Anyway, nobody likes to feel exposed. Nobody does. Another form of shame is in the category of exclusion, to feel like an outsider. How many of you were ever the new boy or girl at school? Don't you hate that? Oh, you get there, you feel like an outsider, a loner, lonely, misunderstood. Basically, all these categories of shame are a complete description of life of a middle schooler. All of them. The middle school is like one unmitigated experience of shame, which is why they behave the way they behave. They clump. They're hiding in groups. They dress alike. They alike. They listen to the same music. They're desperate for that because if shame is about who I am and you're an adolescent, you don't know who you are. Because who you used to be at your mama's breast is not who you are as a 12-year-old. And you're in the gym and you're staring across the gym and looking at girls. So, it's not unusual now for priests in our present culture having middle schoolers coming and saying, I'm a lesbian. And I say, Bobby, you can't be no. Well, I don't know. Everything's possible now. But, what they're saying is, and I've had a few times, like a mother brings like a child in and says, she says she's a lesbian. And she's 11 years old. Come on. And you sit and talk with them, and what you discover is they feel nervous about boys. They are more comfortable around girls. And I think, yeah, it's called friends. Yeah, it's okay. It's not a sexual thing. It's not all of that. It's not all the stuff that they're telling you about, But in a way, they're not being helped because they're giving language that is very confusing. Very confusing. And they're just, in that sense, what's youth culture trying to do? They're negotiating one of the most shame-filled worlds imaginable without a sheriff. And they live in Deadwood. They go to school in Deadwood. Hell, they go to school that actually has shoot-'em-ups. Yeah? You got to feel some way. It happened in somebody else's school. Why can't it happen in mine? Well, because it can. So they do live in Deadwood. And it's a dangerous place. So the exclusion is, who wants to do it? Who wants to be unpopular, uncool, unwelcome, left out, shunned? I have never had a base hit in all of my life. I've not been a lot of baseball teams, but all of my life I've never had a base hit. I just wanted you to feel bad for me. I was not the first pick for the baseball team. But anyway, less important, feeling that people are avoiding you, overlooked, forgotten, or invisible. That experience of shame is really almost, as I said, the default position for adolescents. Even though it gets hidden in a lot of ways, it's just there. The last category that Burgo gives is disappointed expectation. Feeling hurt, feeling rejected or spurned, unlovable, or worse yet, unworthy of love. Ugly, that is, not attractive or fit enough, not masculine or feminine enough, humiliated, unwanted, unvalued, or uncared for, ignored or slighted, unimportant, overlooked or forgotten. I mean, gosh, I'm glad aren't you glad I'm not handing out cards asking you to check these off? So here's to a shame inventory. I passed. It's painful even to hear such things described. And a fascinating property of shame is this is not a clinical term, I call it stickiness. And that is, when we witness shame, we instinctively feel it ourselves. You're attending a child's piano recital. Partway through the recital piece, they forget and get stuck. Nobody in the audience is looking at the child. Everybody's staring at their feet, feeling a communion of shame. Yep. It's one of the reasons our public life is as difficult as it is that it's become normal in, say, political and news speech now to use shame language. And when you hear somebody being shamed, even if you think the person is right, when you hear somebody being shamed, you will feel shame on some level. And so, what happens when you feel shamed? You get depressed, or you get, more often, angry. And so, why is social media the way it is? Because it's a sea of shame. It's a sea of shame. I mean, you write as an Orthodox Christian. You write as an Orthodox priest. You wrote a blog article, and somebody says, you're not Orthodox. Well, it doesn't feel good. It's shaming. You can come back to it and just discuss it, rationally or whatever that way, but that's different than saying you made a mistake or something like that. It's going to the who of who you are, you don't care, that's, all the things we can do, this shame language. And as I say, we're all kind of loaded for this because we've heard so much of it. Everybody's a prickly pear. And we easily can get set off. But this stickiness, how many of you remember the comedian Andy Kaufman? I know it's old people will, on Saturday Night Live and other things. Kaufman used this sticky property of shame in a lot of his comedy routines. He would just get up and do shameful things on stage, and everybody is just, stop it, stop it. I mean, it's just crazy things. And in a way, the humor was him laughing at you because he was manipulating your emotions and just the jokes on the crowd. It wasn't, he got hurt badly doing that. Might have eventually led to his death, but it's not a smart thing to do. I've described shame as an emotional experience of broken communion, and interestingly, sin is often rightly defined as a break in communion. So shame, among many things, is part of the emotional experience of sin. It doesn't mean you did something wrong and now you feel ashamed because you ought to, or you had it coming to you, or you deserved it. I do not mean that at all. I do not believe sin is about, sin is not a legal category. God is not a lawyer. And you do something wrong, it's a symptom of this disease at work in you that we really call sin. Sin, death, all of that corruption is at work in us. But it's really a problem of our being. But the emotions are also part of the experience of our being. And when communion is broken, it is felt like shame, and it gets morphed. I mean, why do so many people have anger issues surrounding religion? Well, very likely because they were ashamed. As a boy, a teenage boy wearing long hair below my shoulders in Greenville, South Carolina, near Bob Jones University, it's like walking around with your sign on the back saying, sick 'em like, saying to the evangelicals, sick 'em like a dog, because they'd see you when they come up to you and start quoting 1 Corinthians. Don't you know that even nature itself teaches you that it is a shame for a man to have long hair? You know it, I hope you've never said it. Oh, mercy. But, and I would usually, as a Jesus freak, I would respond and say, Jesus had long hair. Yeah. And they would say, how do you know? And I'd say, you don't know him? Shame can be a game. But we experience that way. It's interesting, in the opening chapters of Genesis, it tells us the story of the first sin. The man and the woman eat what they were told not to eat, and then we're told their eyes were opened. Their eyes were opened, and they saw that they were naked. And so they hide. That's an experience of shame. It's a terrible vulnerability, and so they hide. And it's the emotional expression of their lost communion with God. They get fig leaves and sew them together, it says. But it's worth noting how God responds to them. He says, where are you? They're hiding. And then he says, Adam says, we heard you coming and we were naked, so we hid. Adam responds with the shame thing. God says, who told you you were naked? And it's like, and then says, did you eat what I told you not to? In a way, God changes the conversation from shame to guilt. Did you do that? Not, are you naked? But did you do that? And then, when it's all done, even though they leave the garden, he covers them. God covers them. He gives them garments of skin. Fathers make a huge, huge commentary on the garments of skin. God covers them. Not only does God cover them, but that covering is a theme that begins there in Genesis and runs throughout the Scriptures. We've lost our communion and therefore entered into the nakedness of shame, and God covers us. Everything from the robes of the priest to ultimately in our holy baptism, which we say we are clothed upon with Christ. Clothed in the resurrection on the last day, Paul says. As many of us as have been baptized into Christ, in the Greek, envio, that is, have been clothed with Christ. Christ is my clothing. I'm not naked anymore. It's possible then for us to understand the work of salvation, at least as this much. It's ever so much more. But one part of the work of salvation is the healing of our shame, the restoration of our communion with God, the world, and ourselves. And it's good in hearing this story to understand God is not your shamer. Instead, what do we hear in the verses, especially we'll use in Holy Week? He did not turn his face from the spitting and the shame. Holy Week in Orthodoxy is not about pain. It's not about a pain payment or that. In Orthodoxy, in Holy Week, it's actually all about shame. He was mocked. What do you think that crown of thorns is about? It's not just they hurt his head. It's a crown of thorns. They put a purple robe on him to mock him. They put a sign over him to make fun of him. They went by and they wagged their heads at him and said, if you are the Son of God, why don't you come down? I mean, even the bad thief is railing at him and making fun of him. This is it. I turn not my face from the spitting and the shame, where Paul says in Philippians 2 that he became obedient unto death. And then he says, even death on a cross, by which he means a shameful death. Not just a death, because the scripture said, cursed is he who hangs on a tree. He bears a shameful death, numbered among the transgressors. You know, not a noble death, not a death in the arena, not a death, like that. No, a shameful death. That's what he bears for us. He enters into that. So I don't care what you did and how you got there. I don't know what made you naked. But Jesus clothes you. He clothes you, and that's what he intends to do with us. So, another question that came to me in trying to understand what place does shame have in the tradition is that it's there, but it's often called by other names. Most especially, it's called by the name of humility. Our culture misuses the word and imagines humility to be a sort of polite attitude that doesn't brag about its excellence. Yes, I do. I'm a great concert pianist. I'm not as good as Rachmaninoff, but, or something. We're humble. Oh, thank you. That sort of thing. Being humble about excellence. Anybody can be humble about being excellent. That's just pretty doggone good. You just absolutely write a poem and knock it out of the park, and someone says, that's a beautiful poem. And you say, thank you. And you're thinking in yourself, you have no idea how hard I worked on that thing. It is just the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, and I just want to dance. And you just, thank you. Thank you. That's easy. It's not humility. Humility is really revealed, true humility is revealed in the context of shame. So I'll be as straightforward about it as possible. Humility does not consist in how we handle our excellence. Humility consists in how we handle our shame. It just makes it really hard. Very, very hard. Everybody can learn to be polite about the stuff they're good at. And that's nothing more than being a gentleman or a lady in the old-fashioned terms of my childhood. But it's shame that marks how we deal with our failures, real and imagined, and that many times gets in the way of repentance. How many times have I heard, especially those who've been new in the church, they're talking about how difficult it is to go to confession, and they will say something like, I just feel like you won't think well of me if you hear what I have to say. And I tell them, it's a great sin for a priest to judge someone in confession. I said, frankly, you can't tell me anything I suspect that I haven't done myself. I am no different than you. We both stand naked before God, and this is for your healing, not for your judgment. And it's what's really going on there is, can I as a priest, can we as a church create a place safe enough for someone to bear their shame? For someone to bear their shame. I think that probably the greatest sin a priest can do is to use the content of confession to shame and control people. I've heard of cases of this, and it's the worst kind of spiritual abuse. And the cases have usually been dealt with by deposing a priest. Sooner the better, because it's a great abuse of this most secret and vulnerable place in human beings. I've written before that we are not saved by our excellence, we're saved by our weakness. Paul is quite clear on this. Paul is so excellent. He said concerning the law, he was blameless. Yeah? He said, I was a Pharisee. I was blameless. I don't know exactly what blameless adds up to as a Pharisee, but that's what Paul was. And Paul then says, he not only was blameless as a Pharisee, he had visions, caught up to the third heaven. heard things unlawful to be uttered. I mean, Paul is so excellent spiritually that he says, essentially, God sent a demon to torment him. And Paul said, I prayed 3 times. Whoa, Paul, I prayed 3 times to ask him to take it away. 3 whole times, Paul? That's really something, you know? I'd still be praying. Paul prays 3 times for God to take it away from him, and God says to him, my strength is made perfect in weakness. So I sometimes tell people, you don't want to bear your shame. You're so good, you just want a demon to come torment you. You know, no. Just be weak. Be weak. You know, Father Thomas Hopko wrote in his 55 Maxims, there's almost a theme in there, but he said, don't be afraid to be small. You know, weak. Protestants will do these church surveys, gifts and talent survey. You tell them what your gifts and talents are, and they give you a job. And so then you have a church full of excellent people. It is a capitalist management tool applied to the church, which makes it a colony of hell. You have all these excellent people, and, you know, that's my job. She can't do that as well as I can. In Orthodoxy, we give you things you can't do. The day I was ordained deacon in Dallas, Texas, I had never seen an ordination. I mean, I had forgotten to look at the service. I was a convert, and I just didn't know that stuff yet. And so I remember praying that day, Jesus, I pray I am the dumbest deacon in the Orthodox Church today. And the Lord said, you are. And how do we gain humility? St. Isaac of Syria writes and says this. He says, this is how we gain humility. Listen to this and think of it in terms of categories of shame. He says, by unceasing remembrance of transgressions. It's like, by remembering your weak stuff and that crap you did. By remembering it. Unceasingly, he says, by anticipation of oncoming death. Well, that'll do it. By inexpensive clothing. By always preferring the last place, you know, by always running to do the tasks that are the most insignificant and disdainful. You know, the holy fools that we celebrate so much, what do? They voluntarily step into shame and do these things. St. Xenia of Petersburg, you know, people making fun of her. I mean, it sounds so great when we tell the saint story, but you know, when she's walking around Petersburg, ain't nobody thinks she's a saint. They're just spitting at her, calling her names and things. It's just the things that people do. You know how we are. It's like she was on Facebook. He says, by abhorrence of material gain, by raising the mind above reproach. Now he's kind of dealing with the shame. By raising the mind above reproach and the accusation of every man and above zealotry. By not being someone whose hand is against everyone and against whom everyone's hand is set against him. But anyway, this is this model. Listen to this from a secular direction. They actually have a lot of similarity. This Burgo wrote in his book, Complete Secularist. He says, I believe that the experience of shame in many cases presents us with an opportunity to grow and learn. If we listen to it, shame sometimes tells us who we are and who we expect ourselves to be. What largely stands in the way of personal growth is our defenses against an inability to tolerate shame. You know, the elder Sophrony, when he was teaching the priest-monk Father Zacharias in Essex, and who was getting ready to become a confessor, to begin to hear confessions, he said to them, he said, especially of the younger ones, but for all, but he said, teach them to bear a little shame. I had the privilege several years ago when I started working on shame to go to England and spent some time with Father Zacharias and said, tell me about shame. And it was just one of the most beneficial days of my life. I realized when it was done that he really hadn't said anything that I hadn't read in one of his books, but the difference was is he said it to me, and that becomes a word. But toxic shame is crippling, and it needs attention. It can need clinical attention. You know, so it's not your fault. It's not your fault. It's not your fault. It's very important to know. It's not your fault. and it's okay to ask for help. And it's okay to say, I mean, if you've been through that, you're not ready to bear a little shame. Because the problem is, even a little shame will touch the deep wound of the unattended toxic shame, and you just can't bear it. You know, you just can't bear it. You're not ready yet. And that's okay. It's okay. You have other medical issues going on that Jesus means to heal and deal with those things. There's this quote from St. Therese of Lisieux, a Catholic saint whom I like a great deal. I love this quote of hers. She said, "If you can bear serenely the trial of being displeasing to yourself, then you will be for Jesus a place of refuge." Now, isn't that just sweet? Ooh, that's why I love her. St. John of the Ladder, in the 4th book of the Ladder, writes and says, sometimes you can only heal shame by shame. Tells a story about a man who comes to the abbot at this monastery he's visiting, and the man has been a murderer, a thief, and he describes just about every form of sexual perversion you can imagine and all of these terrible, terrible things, and he wants to become a monk. And the abbot says to him, "Would you be willing to say those things publicly?" And the man said, "I would be glad to shout them on any street corner in Alexandria." The abbot says, "Well," anyway, sets up a thing so that they have a gathering liturgy, and all the brothers in the monastery gather together. And he has a couple of brothers drag him in, kind of roughing him up and beating him and doing all this sort of stuff, and where he just has to confess it all in front of the brothers. You know, and St. John, who's visiting, asks him about that, and the abbot says, sometimes you can only heal shame with shame. You know, that's not how we do it, but this is a serious case, you know, of murder, apparently multiple, and every other kinds of perversion possible. He needs, you know, and of course, it's always like it is in these Desert Fathers. You get a story and it happened in an afternoon, and you know, that's great. Oftentimes, it's much slower than that. You get the guy who comes to the parish, and it wasn't murder, but it was a lot of other things, and he's simply being an ass for a long time because he hasn't tended to his brokenness. He hasn't tended with his shame. And can you be patient enough? Can we, as a people, be patient enough to heal them? God has given us the tools. I mean, the sacrament of confession and communion. You know, the servant of God takes the most precious and holy body and blood of our Lord and God and Savior Jesus Christ. You are covered with the righteousness of Christ again and again and again. As the stole is laid over you, you know. The psalmist writes and says in Psalm 131, "I have comforted my soul like a weaned child at its mother's breast." You know, the child is upset. He's not going to go back to nursing again, but he's learned to quieten himself. And when I was talking to Father Zacharias, it's kind of, he gave me that verse, and he said, when this is happening with you and you're feeling it, he said, don't run from it. Just sit with it in the presence of God. Just sit with it and pray, "Oh God, comfort me. Comfort me." It's kind of part of my prayer routines when these things come up, is going to the church and just sitting in the altar and saying, "Oh God, comfort me." You know, not, "Oh God, why did I do that? Oh God, I can't believe I was that stupid." I mean, sitting there reciting my shame, that does you no good. That is not repentance. That is not repentance. That's just increasing the lack of communion, you know, the distance and the loneliness. Saying to God, "Oh God, comfort me, and I will sit in your presence." And he will comfort. He will teach you to comfort your soul like a weaned child at the mother's breast. Jesus says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who were sent to it, how often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing." Or dear verse in Matthew 11, "Come to me all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." God covered them. Think of how Jesus treated the woman who was taken in adultery. You know? I mean, I've always kind of been freaked out when it says she was taken in the act. I think, well, they didn't show that in the movie. But there's no condemnation. He stands between her. He covers her with himself. And he says, he who's without sin, let him cast the first stone. He puts himself between her and them, and then he says, where are they who condemn you? And she says, they're gone. And he says, wow, and neither do I condemn you. Can you imagine? I mean, goodness gracious, she's already done the shame stuff. She had no choice. They drug her out in the street. Everybody in town knows it. Her husband knows it. Everybody knows it. God knows it. And God says, neither do I condemn you. This is a good God. I can't tell you how many times I've spoken. I do a lot of volunteer work in drug and alcohol rehab. And the number of times with because people are just strung out on drugs and alcohol, they've got plenty of shame going around. And there are many of them, especially down where I am in Tennessee, God would never do that. God is dangerous. God is wrathful. God is going to send you to hell. And the number of times just watching tears rolling down cheeks when they're just hearing this story, and someone, instead of talking about hell, is telling them that God loves them. Neither do I condemn you. Oh, what good news. How is that not what we say all the time in the Orthodox service? For he is a good God and he loves mankind. And I try to remember when I write, be kind. One of my rules for my blog is almost the first rule in it is be kind when you write, and if you're not, I'll delete you. And in my kindness and mercy, I will cover up that social media sin you just committed. And there's a delete feature on Facebook too that I love tremendously. And but I mean, this is what he's called us to do. The world out there is going mad. It is crazy. I do not have any kind of scheme of how we bring them back, except for the fact that they are human beings exactly like me and you, even if they got crazy ideas. They're just like me. They got plenty of shame. They need to be covered. And they can't, part of our culture is trying to do it with shamelessness. It doesn't work. You go out and you do the parade and you do it in front of everybody, and you know what? You got to keep doing it over and over and over. Let me read books to your children in the library. Try to do something to cover up and say this is not wrong. No. They need to hear the love of God. They need to hear it's not condemnation they need love. They need to know that their shame can be covered and not just added to. And this is difficult. It's really hard to do, Sometimes we're talking about children and, issues involved. So this is very difficult. But this is our ministry. The thing I trust in is that you and I, were born for this hour. This is our time. From all eternity, God knew us, called us by name, and meant for us to be right here. So, here we are, and He's given us love, He's forgiven us, covered us, and even though we're working outside the garden, we've got our Flintstone clothes. And, the garments of skin He's covered us with. It's just the righteousness of Christ. And we can go out there and be brave to heal other people. So I think it's something we have to slowly model in our lives, a little vulnerability. I got a lot of flaws in me, and I do, and they're embarrassing and all that sort of stuff. But part of the style I use when I write actually is to share a little bit of that. I don't share them all because I'm not ready there. But the vulnerability, I get lots of responses from people that it made it possible for them to say things they didn't think they could say, or to understand that God loves them that much. If someone, if a priest can say something. I wrote an article this past year on anxiety, depression, and panic attacks. The views went through the roof. And that didn't anywhere near the emails that I got. I got comments, but the emails, because they couldn't talk about it in public. But nobody for years I've had this, and nobody ever told me these things. And I look at that and I think, Jesus, thank you for letting me have panic attacks. Thank you for letting me be an anxious child. Thank you for all the trouble it has caused me in my life, and I thank you for comforting me so that we can comfort one another, as Paul taught us to do. So anyway, that's pretty much what I have to say about this tonight, and I don't know how much time I used, probably too much. Goodness, it's not even quite an hour. But we've got some room for Q&A, do we?
Yes.
Okay.
Right over here to the mic.
Yeah. Yay. You know how it was in basketball, in high school basketball, and someone fouls and everybody in the stands go, you. Yeah, we'll do that to people who come to the mic. No. Comments even is fine. You don't have to have questions or stuff, and maybe there aren't any. Yes.
So, this doesn't pick up. One of the things you said early on was that the only boundary in the garden was the no of the tree. But I wonder if you could talk some about the boundary of other people, because I feel like our limits that God gives us in our body, like you just said, having a problem or your weakness, the thing that God gives you. Like I write about disability, and disability as a limit is a way that I get to know God. It's a gift in that way. And so I wanted to see if you could talk some about, I want to hear your words about how other people are our boundaries and our limits and how that's a gift.
Yeah, okay, the question was about how boundaries work in our life with other people. I would add, and with ourselves. I mean, Burgo was saying that these kinds of experiences of shame, or I would say here, boundaries, also teach you who you are. Going there to find that out. I mean, I grew up in an alcoholic family, so I was raised a codependent. Mama taking you out at night, sending you into a beer joint to get your daddy back out. Crazy stuff. And, a boundary was reaching a place in my adult life to say to my mama, he's your husband, he ain't my problem. Sorry. But you're a priest. Sorry. Go get you a different one. I think it's healthy and important to know. I think there's a whole lot to say about boundaries, another talk. I tell people, one thing that's important is actually when you're uncomfortable, pay attention to it. It might even be that you're just not ready to be in the situation and you later would be, but pay attention to not being comfortable. I especially said that to my girls when they were growing up. You in a situation makes you feel, uncomfortable, get out, call me, whatever. Draw your gun. Boundaries, they really matter, and it's because in Trinity, there's the old Latin kind of triangle thing. So you have Deus at the middle, and you have Pater, Filius, and Spiritus Sanctus, and you have Est. Each is God, but between them it says non est. The Father is not the Son. The old Athanasian Creed, who knows who wrote it? The Son is not the Father. The Father is not the Son. And there's something about that that to me is part of the mystery of personhood. You're not me. I'm not you. And it calls for a kind of respect. And that the part of the relations of the Trinity in the Fathers is the perichoresis, which is about dance. The one thing I know about dance is I can't occupy your space, particularly your feet. I'm a terrible dancer. I wish I was Greek. Anyway, I could dance. I want to dance like Zorba. But respecting the space of the other, and it is so hard because of the ways that we're pushing each other in our culture to give room and respect. I'm an old man now, And my children are adults. My oldest will be 40 this year next, and the youngest is about 28 or whatever. And you begin to discover them as your kids grow up. Oddly enough, they don't all agree with you. And none, even though you taught them better than that. And, you know, and it's very difficult as a parent, you know, to not still want to run their little lives. You know, to have that child tell you, I got a tattoo. Where? No. My wife said, what does it say? My child said, oh, no words. No words on it. It's just a flower. I said, okay. But, you know, you just have to give people room. I prayed, and like in dealing with them, you got to do this with other people too. I prayed for their salvation, and it just has dawned on me as the years have gone by, I have no idea what that looks like. And if I'm blessed and fortunate before God, that won't be finished until I'm long left this world. You know, I'm going to watch their salvation from afar, hopefully up close from afar. But, you know, this is, and that's true. I mean, what is God doing in the world? Well, He's gathering together all things in Christ Jesus. It might not look like it, but He is. This is what it looks like when God's providence is at work for the salvation of all. He's gathering in it. So part of that is that you know, one of the reasons we don't respect each other's boundaries is because I'm afraid, you know, that you're going to violate my space or something like that, you know. And it's, as crazy as we are, God's in charge. God's in charge. It's a good question, though. And as I say, there's so much more to be said about it. And, you know, yeah.
I was wondering if you could expound a little bit more on teaching children how to bear a little bit of shame.
Ooh. Well, you know, I don't know about teaching them to bear a little shame. First off, I don't like using shame with children. There's so many better ways to deal with a human being than getting in there and just violating the daylights out of them. You know, you can get things done with it, but I mean, no one's going to be a better person by feeling like they're a bad person. You know, and I'm not talking about giving participation trophies or anything like that, you know, but I think one of the things with children that, you know, how do we teach the ability to do this is I create a space where they can. You know, when parents in my church, when the kids are like 7 or 8 and they're going to bring them to confession, I tell them, look, I'm not going to do a class on sin for them, like how to confess their sins in confession. Now, this is just me. You can take this, other priests do other things. But me, I say, look, they're 7 or 8. They don't have any serious sin yet. This is not what I said. The only thing I want them to know at age 7 or 8 is that it's a safe place. I've had kids come and sit next to me for confession, just mum, don't say anything. And I'll say, well, is that all? I go, uh-huh. And so I'll put the stole over them and I'll give absolution, you know. And you might have to do that for 3 or 4 years. But, you know, when they're 7 or 8, there's not a lot. When they're 12 or 13, it's coming, you know. And I want them to have a safe place so that they can say that and know that there they will not get shamed. You know, and what a terrible thing to bear a little shame and it not be covered, much less it be used against them. You know, so we have to be, you know, so I think in that sense there's a gentleness, there's a kindness. Saint Silouan told the story about his father. Saint Silouan, they were working in the fields in Russia one day, and it was a fast day, and his father sent him back to the house to bring him some food. And he forgot it was a fast day, and he brought him some meat. And the father ate it. 6 months later, he brought it up to Silouan and said, do you remember that day I was in the field and you brought me something to eat? He said it was a fast day. He said, and it was like eating carrion, you know, and just sort of shared that with him. Silouan he said, my father was a better spiritual father than any, the great fathers on Athos he had. He said he waited 6 months before he, chastised him at all, to wait for the right time. Woo! I know for myself as a parent, one of the things that was very helpful to us as Orthodox was for me as a parent to learn to prostrate myself before my children and ask for their forgiveness. How do they learn it? They watch me do it. Yeah. My daughter, she's baby daughter, she's 16, and the movie Da Vinci Code came out, and she asked me for some money to go to the movies with her friends, and I said, which movie? And she said, Da Vinci Code. And that was just sort of mashed a button, and I went off, and I'm stomping around the house, and I'm angry, and I'm just mouthing off, and I'm saying that movie is against everything I've ever worked for and everything I stand against, and I'm just raving, and I don't know where it came from, and like that, she's sitting there just weeping, and then she goes back in her room, and I'm just standing there. And then I came to my senses and sat down, and whoa, the shame came, and I realized it's me. And I went into my daughter and I made a prostration before her. And I handed her $20. And I told her, there is nothing you can see in that film that even comes close to what I just did to you. Here's the money. It was funny the next day, around the afternoon, I said to her, well, sweetie, how was the movie? And she says, well, Papa, she goes, I ruined it for everybody. And I said, what's that? She goes, well, we're watching the movie, and I kept saying, oh, that's not true. That's not true. And then, sweet words, she said, I'm your daughter, Papa. Amen, but how do we do it? You do it. The best way to teach a child. I love Stanley Hauerwas that I studied under at Duke. Hauerwas said, almost no matter what you do, your children are going to grow up to be just like you. That's good news and bad news. So, be what you want your child to be. Yeah. Something else? Or? Well, you all have been really sweet, and this felt like it was a okay session with each other. So I appreciate you, and thank you so much, and be kind. God bless.